الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد النبي المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, as we continue in our lessons on Maraqi, on al-Falah, al-Ilah of the great Imam Abu al-Ikhlas al-Shumbulani, we have reached the section on as-Su'l, correct? And this relates to what came before in a sense. Why? Because the rulings related to water, right, and the different ahkam of water are reflected in leftover water as well. Right? As-Su'l is here in this context referring to leftover water. There is a broader context of Su'l, right, which, as Imam Tahtawi points out in his Hashiyah, Su'l generally in the Arabic language refers to baqiyatu shay, is that which is left over from something, right? Or what is left behind, al-Fadla. Those are the two meanings in the Qamus al-Muhit, for example, of Imam al-Firozabadi. So the Su'l that are mentioned here is referring to the water that is left over, as he'll tell us. Left over after the drinking of either an animal or a human. What is the consideration with respect to the leftover water? No, the saliva, right? So the ruling of the water would follow the ruling of the saliva. And the ruling of the saliva follows the ruling of the meat. Right? You need السوق, you need اللعاب يتبع اللحم. Right? The saliva takes the ruling of the meat لأنه يتولد منه, because it comes from it. So that's the general principle. We'll see that there are exceptions made by the Prophet ﷺ, right, out of evident necessity. In the case of the cat, right? In the case of the cat, because of the illat al-tawaf, and we'll see the case of predatory birds, whose permissibility, of whose saliva, of the water they've drunk from, they've deduced from the sunnah and there's a basis there of what's called legal preference, istihsan, as we will see when we come to it. But that's the governing principle, right? That the saliva follows the ruling of the leftover water. Generally follows the ruling of the saliva follows the ruling of the meat, with the exceptions that arise textually or legally, as we will see. Now we note here, of course, that the definition given by the author, right, for Su'l is contextual, right? Is contextual, not absolute, right? And students of knowledge often err when it comes to definitions. Why? Because they take a definition, even the linguistic definition given by the fuqaha is contextual to what they're talking about very often, right? So the author of a book giving you the meaning in the Arabic language is not a substitute for actually looking up the word in a dictionary of the Arabic language. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, فصل في بيان أحكام السؤر. So this is a section on the أحكام of سؤر. Let's read the matan first. والماء القليل إذا شرب منه حيوان يكون على 4 أقسام. A small body of water, if an animal drinks from it, takes one of 4 rulings. So the comment, he says in the commentary, والماء القليل الذي بينا قدره, whose definition, whose extent we've elucidated previously, وهو بدون 10 في 10. That's less than 10 cubits by 10 cubits, 5 meters by 5 meters. ويسمى سؤرا, right? Sorry, 10 في 10. ولم يكن جاريا, and this water is not flowing, because if it were flowing, then the الماء الجاري في حكم الماء الكثير, right? Flowing water is like a large body of water in its rulings and implications. So إذا شرب منه حيوان يكون على أحد 4 أقسام. If an animal drinks from it, it takes one of 4 rulings. وما أبقاه بعد شربه يسمى سؤرا بهمز عينه. And what remains after the animal drinks from it is called su'r. But the relationship here, right, between su'r and leftover water is that leftover water from drinking is ضمن مفهوم السؤر, is one part of the meaning of su'r. Because in the Arabic language, su'r refers to baqiyatu shay, what is left over from something. But it's used most frequently for water. Right? But what is of concern in this chapter is leftover water. Why? Because we're looking at Bab al-Tahara. We want to get to the rulings of wudu and ghusl. Right? يسمى سؤرا بهمز عينه. سؤرا, right? With a hamza. Because sur, without a hamza has a different meaning, right? Which is a construction that surrounds, it's like the walls that surround a city, right? Sur al-Madina, for example, right? وَيُسْتَعَارُ لِبَقِيَّةِ الطَّعَامِ. He said, and it's used metaphorically for leftover food. And that is contested, right? So Imam al-Shurubulani takes the opinion that su'r literally refers to leftover water, and it's used isti'aratan, it's used in a metaphorical usage, right? Which has become now common for leftover food. But more rigorously, it's used for leftover water or food or other leftover things, but غلب استعماله على بقية الماء, but it's generally used for leftover water. The Tahtawi disagrees with Imam Shurubulani here, but the linguists also disagreed with this. والجمع أسآر, right? والفعل أسأر, and the fi'l is أسأر, أي أبقى شيئا مما شربه, meaning he left something of what he drank. والنعت منه سآر, and then the na'at or the sifa from it is سآر على غير قياس, and this is not according to normal patterns of the verb, it's an unusual verb. لأن قياسه مسئر, because the qiyas would be مسئر, ونظيره أجبره فهو جبار. Likewise, the verb أجبر فهو جبار. Because normally you would say أجبر فهو مجبر, right? And that's because the the na'at from it, the na'at doesn't necessarily always follow the qiyas, right? Sometimes just because of that's that's Arabic usage, and very often because of takhfif, right? Or wuduh, different reasons why they might be, but it goes back to the usage of the Arabs. Okay. And there's khilaf on this. And as Tahtawi mentions, when they talk about meanings of words, when they say al-Majd, it refers to Majd al-Firuzabadi, the author of al-Qamus. Right? And the name of the dictionary in Arabic is Mu'jam. Right? Qamus is actually the name for Imam al-Firuzabadi's dictionary, al-Qamus al-Muhit. But it became so prevalent that then people started using the word qamus for a dictionary. Hatil qamus. Right? Let me bring the qamus. Even now there's other, qamus al-JD, qamus al-really dumbed down, etc. Okay. So there's 4 categories. Al-awwal min aqsam al-su'ur. The first of the categories of the su'ur, طاهر مطهر, pure and purifying, بالاتفاق, right? With agreement. من غير كراهة, with no dislike في استعماله, in its use. Of course, when they say something like this, leaving out external considerations, right? But that's assumed. That doesn't belong to somebody else. You're not. You don't have weird intentions in drinking it. Because when is it haram to drink water that belongs to you? Pure water.
If you drink so much that the next cup.
No. Just when would it be haram to drink this?
Fasting.
Then you're not fasting. One is just intention. What if you drank this imagining that it is alcohol, for example? Okay? So that those things you can't consider, because otherwise you go to the land of the absurd, right? There's all kinds of possibilities. Fuqaha consider direct and relevant possibilities. Okay? من غير كراهة في استعماله, with no dislike in using it. وهو ما شرب منه آدمي. It's that which a human drank from. Right? أو, let's go to the matan for a second. أو فرس أو ما يؤكل لحمه. Or a horse or anything whose meat is edible. Okay? أي لو ذبح, where it's slaughtered. So the first category, وما شرب منه آدمي, is what a human drinks from, because the lu'ab al-adami tahir, because the saliva of a human is pure. So that's where he puts the condition in the commentary, لَيْسَ بِفَمِهِ نَجَاسَةً, who doesn't have any filth in his mouth. Okay? And you put the conditions. What if there was filth? And we'll see that in a moment. What's the basis for this? لما روى الإمام مسلم رحمه الله عن السيدة عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها أنها قالت: كنت أشرب وأنا حائض فأناوله النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فيضع فاه على موضع في. Right? Because of what's related by Imam Muslim and others, that Sayyida Aisha رضي الله تعالى عنها said, I used to drink when in a state of menstruation, and then I would give what I drank from to the Prophet ﷺ, and he would drink from where I drank from, from the place where my lips touched the cup. And there's many lessons in this. The legal lesson is because the Arabs were bewildered when it came to what are the rulings that should apply to the ha'id. Because they didn't have shara. the in the biblical tradition, so certainly in the Old Testament, the rules of related to a menstruating woman are very, very strict. Not to eat, in terms of eating and even sitting where a menstruating woman has sat down, etc. Right? And how much of that was from what was the original tashri'ah upon Bani Israel by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how much of that was the later interpretive restrictions placed in the rabbinical interpretive tradition. That's a separate matter, but it was very, very strict. So we see a number of these incidents happening, and the Prophet wanted to break that. The Prophet asked, for his hair to be brushed, to brush his hair, and he was inside the masjid. Sayyidah Aisha said, "But I'm ha'id." He said, "The haid is not in your hands, so you can give it to me when I'm in the masjid." Right? So here, and also of course the aspect of affection, right? Affection, general affection to one's spouse, and expressing that through specific acts, that you turn it around and drink from where she drank from, but also expressing affection to someone in a state of haid, that you can maintain general intimacy even in a state of haid. Okay. ولا فرق بين الكبير والصغير, and the su'ur, the leftover water of the human being is pure. لا فرق بين الكبير والصغير, between an adult and a child. والمسلم والكافر, nor a Muslim or a non-Muslim. والحائض والجنوب, likewise someone in menstruation or in a state of janaba, that which requires ghusl. Then what happens if there was najasa in their mouth? وَإِذَا تَنَجَّسَ فَمُهُ, right? If their mouth was najis, and this is biyaqeen, with certitude, right? Biyaqeen. So this بيقين or بغلبة ظن القوي. بيقين, if it's you, you know it. If it's someone else, by undeniable signs. But of course, you have to question your dhann, right? Because what is the asl in another person? Is that their actions are sound and upright. So let's say you saw someone in a bar drinking a colored drink. They're Muslim. They walked out. Do you assume that it's khamr? No. You assume maybe they're drinking. The asl is, and is contrary to that, right? So you wouldn't make that hukum. It does not have to. How they drank alcohol, okay? Or they ate or drank something najis. From eating najis would be someone ate pork or unslaughtered meat. But also, how could your mouth be najis without doing anything haram?
Your gums were bleeding?
Bleeding gums. And again, not, if something like that repeats, spit out and see, is there clear blood? A lot of people get waswasa, simple thing. So this member said, every time the adhan goes, my gums start bleeding. I said, when the adhan goes, spit in the sink and see what, oh my God. Once I started doing that, it stopped. No, it didn't stop. Just, so beware of the waswasa. But if someone's gums were bleeding, right? وَلَتَنَجَّسَ فَمُهُ فَشَرِبَ الْمَاءَ مِنْ فَوْرِهِ, and they drank the water immediately. And of course, this is if they drank the water directly. Okay? So if there's a bucket and you have bleeding gums, don't drink straight from the bucket. Take it with your hand. And that's why it's recommended, actually, to الماء القليل in its مستحب الاغتراف منه بكوز أو مثله, right? That if you have a small amount of water, that you don't stick your hand in to it, even, let alone your mouth, but they use a cup. Why? One, to protect the water from najasa. Number two, to protect it from dirt. Number three, لأنه مستقذر عادة وطبعا, because people normally consider that like someone sticking their hand into the water and then they're going to use it. Okay? So fuqaha didn't like, they built these pools in the masajid. They much preferred people using cups, but people refused to. So it was like a big. The fuqaha were not very happy with it, but things don't work as the fuqaha wish. Although if they did, things would be better. So وإذا تنجس فمه فشرب الماء مباشرة من فوره تنجس. If one's mouth becomes najis, permissibly or impermissibly, one drinks the water directly, and immediately the water, that leftover water becomes najis, with the conditions that we've taken, that it is a small amount of non-flowing water. وإن كان بعدما تردد البزاق في فمه مرات وألقاه أو ابتلعه قبل الشرب فلا يكون سؤره نجسا عند أبي حنيفة وأبي يوسف. Right? If one's mouth became filthy, but then some time passed, in which the saliva went through one's mouth and one either spat it out or swallowed. Spat it out, because if you have blood in your mouth, what are you supposed to do? You're not supposed to swallow it, to the extent that you can. Last week I walked in, I had no, when you can, but sometimes you can't. Like I had two, major nosebleed, and my blood was flowing down, getting into my mouth. But I'm surrounded by people. It's very hard to keep spitting. Like I'm gonna have to just be spitting out the whole time. So what I could spit out, I spat into tissue paper, but I just had to swallow it. It was hard to breathe. I couldn't breathe through my nose, right? So generally, to the extent that one can, one does not swallow najasa, like flowing blood. Okay? It's good to think legally. I was very happy actually when it happened. There's all kinds of legal and adab lessons from the nosebleed. So all the people coming and interrupting. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh, kif al-hal? Like I'm looking down because my noses, both noses, it's like blood going all over the place. Right? Kif al-hal? And someone giving a khutbah on ajr and this and that, Shaykh. But then this nurse, this sister who's a nurse, stepped in and told everyone to please, very politely, everyone please move back. And she, sometimes you have to take lead in something. That's right. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant her ease. And then there's all these medical students came. All of them want to give me advice. Said, could all the medical students please move back? She asked one person who's a medical doctor to come forward, and he sort of checked, right? Because every situation has a proper adab related to it. So if one had spat out the saliva or swallowed it such that now it's not reasonably sure that the mouth is najis, فَلَا يَكُونُ سُؤْرُهُ نَجِسًا. Then their su'ur, the leftover water, would not be najis. عند أبي حنيفة وأبي يوسف, according to Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf. in the comment, they said unless one's mustache is really long, because then the saliva would clean out the mouth, but the dangling hair of the mustache would have become najis. Like if the mustache is so clearly long, and this is a bad habit of some people in rural areas, they wear not just a chunky mustache, but a mustache that covers the lips, right? Then it would be, but it would not be because of the su'ur, it would be because of the najis, the mustache, that comes into contact with the water. Now, there's another issue that is mentioned by Imam al-Tahtawi, and there's some confusion regarding it, which is, what about drinking the leftover water of a non-mahram? Right? And some people get really freaked out about that, because in some of the Hanafi fiqh books there is, they just mention it's makruh to have the su'ur of the su'ur al-ajnabiyyati makruh. Right? The leftover water from an unrelated woman is makruh. Some people it's like this water is over here, and of course the other way around too. Su'ur al-ajnabi, there's some leftover, oh, I can't drink it. What if it's a man? And rulings have a context, right? So Tahtawi mentioned, and it's not specific to someone who's ajnabi. The ruling is, yukrahu, he says, تنبيه يكره أن يشرب سؤر غيره إن وجد منه لذة إلا للزوجين. It is makruh to eat, to drink the leftover water of anyone if one finds physical pleasure from doing so. Okay? And this is and anything in which one finds the physical inclination of the kind that is unbecoming, except between spouses, any such action, if there is that expression, that fulfillment of desire, that is to be avoided, right? Without getting weird about it. So they say, وَكَذَا يُكْرَهُ. So that's why they said, for example, it's disliked to go to a barber that is amrad, that is prepubescent. Why? But it's not, don't go to young barbers if one finds, a physical istihsan, a physical liking towards them, right? Or because we do not deny that, that men may have a physical inclination towards young men, and similarly, if someone, or a woman, for example, to go to get her hair cut, etc., in a salon where the women are indecently dressed, so that they may feel an attraction towards them, it would be makruh to go to any such service where there are ready alternatives, right? And the same thing to get a massage, for example, if one finds the masseuse of the same gender attractive, above and beyond how things would be if it was a regular masseuse, right? Now going back to the text, so the saliva would clean out the mouth, according to Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf. Why? Because all liquids remove najasa, according to Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf. But he says, لَكِنَّهُ مَكْرُوهُ. But if there was najasa in the mouth and it was just removed by the saliva, it's makruh لقول محمد بعدم طهارة النجاسة بالبزاق عندهم بل بمكروه يعني أو خلاف الأولى right right or suboptimal right because Imam Muhammad said that najasa cannot be removed by saliva according to him because he made a condition that najasa needs to be removed by water, right? Not by the ma'i'at. We saw that previously as well. Now, al-khuruj min al-khilaf mustahab. Avoiding khilaf is recommended, not expected. Right? So the karaha here is karaha tanzih, but closer to being khilaf al-awla, to being what's suboptimal. Okay. That's number one. Su'r al-adami. So we clarified that the saliva of someone unrelated to you is only disliked if you find desire. Like Zubayr is always dreaming of Zubaydah, and that's the leftover water of Zubaydah. So he doesn't drink it because it's water, he drinks it because it'll make him yearn for Zubaydah, etc. That we dislike. Okay? And of course there's a decorum and tact, but for example, if someone wanted to drink the leftover water of one of the ulama or salihin, ala wajh al-tabarruk, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. But of course with the restraint befitting, dignified gender relationship. Like you say, I want to drink the Shaykh's water or the Shaykha's water. Does it with the tact befitting of the believer. Okay. أو شرب منه فرس. Right? Or that's drunk by, that was all the leftover water from a horse. Now a horse is from the animals whose meat is edible. But it's mentioned because there is karaha, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, in eating its meat. But the karaha is not intrinsic. According to, there's khilaf about it, but the relied upon position is that ittifaq, the meat of a horse is edible, is makulu lahm, but it's disliked because it's considered a precious animal, which is an ala for jihad, but also because one, because it's ala to jihad, the second is it's a precious animal. A horse was very valuable and an honored animal in that sense. So for someone to slaughter the horse, it's like, you need heating, so you burn to your car. Right? Maybe it'll give you some heating, but but this is not an absolute ruling because it came up in, like, for example, in Central Asia, elsewhere, where there's a lot of Hanafis, and a lot of horses, the steppes of Central Asia, where it was from their habit in lands like Kazakhstan and elsewhere, where eating meat, horse meat was very common and had a lot of horses. So that comes up in Ahkam al-Hadr al-Ibaha about the eating of horses, but he mentions it. أو شرب منه فرس فإن سؤر الفرس طاهر بالاتفاق, because the leftover water of the horse is by agreement طاهر على الصحيح, because they relied upon position من غير كراهة, without dislike. Now the karaha of eating it is for the reasons that we mentioned. Right? And those who mention that it's makruh to eat horse meat, right? Imam al-Tahtawi quotes from, relates from Shaykh al-Islam, amongst the fuqaha of the Hanafis, it generally refers to Khwaharzada, that eating horse meat in Zahir al-Riwayah is somewhat disliked, and this is ma'lul bi'illat, إتلاف المالية and كونه آلة الحرب. Okay? And that's the relied upon position, and it quotes مجمع الأنهر, Shaykh Zada's commentary on ملتقى الأبحر. Okay, Bismillah. أو شرب منه ما أي إني بمعنى حيوان يؤكل لحمه, or any animal whose meat is edible. كالإبل والبقر والغنم, such as camels and cows and cattle, sheep, goats. ولا كراهة في سؤرها. And there's no dislike in their leftover water. إن لم تكن جلالة, unless they roam amongst the filth. الجلالة التي تجول في القاذورات. تأكل الجلة بالفتح وهي في الأصل البعرة. It eats the jalla, which the original meaning of jalla is excrement. وقد يكن بها على العذرة, and it can be used for, so the ba'ar is from animals and عذرة can be for humans. فإن كانت جلالة فسؤرها من القسم الثالث مكروه. And if it's of the animals that roam around filth, then it's from the third category, which he mentions next, which will be mentioned in a bit, right? Which is makruh, if one has alternatives. Okay, and we'll see. والقسم الثاني, so that's the first. طاهر مطهر غير مكروه. Second category, والقسم الثاني سؤر نجس. Right? It's saliva that is najis, najasatan غليظة, heavy filth. Really? يعني وهو ما لا يعفى عنه إلا القليل. That is filth. That only a little extent is excused. And وقيل خفيفة, and it is said that this would be light filth. Now, الغلظة والخفة إنما تظهر في الجامدات لا في المائعات. Right? Something being heavy filth or light filth is only manifest in solids, not liquids. So what would the implication of that be on the leftover water? It's najasa mughallala. So if that liquid gets that water, that was, of this category, that is su'run najis, leftover water that is najis, its implication would be, if you get it on yourself, then the rulings of najasa mughallala apply, that only a little of it, the extent of a dirham, is excused. And it being najasa mughallala is, which he mentions, is the stronger opinion, because when he mentions qeel, and it is said, this is min siyar al-tamrir, right? Or min siyar al-tad'if. It indicates weakness. And this is what's mentioned in the Dur, and Ibn Abdin says, and that's what is chosen in the Bahr al-Ra'iq, and the discussion is there as for the reasoning. And we'll come when we look at إزالة النجاسة, or the difference between the najasa al-mughallala and al-mukhaffafa. And basically, the najasa al-mughallala is, according to Abu Hanifa, is filth in which the primary texts only indicate it's being filthy. ما لم تتعارض الأدلة في كونه نجسا. Right, so only a little is excused. There's other types of filth, which is najasa mukhaffafa, which the primary text would appear to have ta'arud, to be in conflict as to whether it's najis or not. Abu Hanifa understood that it's not that whether they're najis or not, it relates to how much of it is excused. And that's najasa mukhaffafa, ما يعفى عن كثيره, right? Which is ما دون ربع الثوب, less than 1/4 of the body. We're coming. Glad you can read ahead. Wish. So this the su'r al-najis لا يجوز استعماله. It's not permitted to use. أي لا يصح التطهير به بحال. You cannot use it for purification. Right? And this is, it's because it's najis, so it's neither طاهر في نفسه, so you cannot use it to remove filth, and it's not mutahhir, so you cannot use it for wudu or ghusl. Okay, so tathir here refers to both removal of filth, right? Because a najis لا يزول بالنجس. Okay? ولا يشربه إلا مضطر كالميتة. And filthy water is not drunk except in a state of اضطرار, of necessity, like eating an unslaughtered animal. Right? Water is najis, you can't drink from it. It'll be like eating the meita, right? It needs a situation of necessity. And of course, when there is necessity, they say you can only have to the extent by which you would survive. قدر ما يقيم به البنية. Okay? As mentioned by Imam Tahtawi, quoting from Allama Nuh. Allama Nuh Effendi, Ibn Abdi quotes from quite a bit in this Hashia. وهو أي السؤر النجس ما شرب منه الكلب, is that which any inedible animal drank from, which includes الكلب, so يعني سواء فيه الكلب الصيد كلب صيد أو ماشية وغيره. And in this, it's the same whether it is a hunting dog or a guide dog. Like the hunting dog, the kalb al-mashia is the one with the shepherd, right? Like a shepherd dog, right? وغيره, or other dogs, whether it's for permissible usage or impermissible usage. لما روى الدراقطني عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في الكلب يلغ في الإناء أنه يغسل 3 أو 5 أو 7. That in what's related by Daraqutni from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ related about the dog who lapped up water, he drank water with his tongue, from a container, that container should be washed 3 times or 5 times or 7 times. So what did we take from that? That the container would become filthy. Now interestingly, of course, al-Daraqutni, who was a great muhaddith, an imam in ilal, his sunan, he wrote it basically to critique the proofs of the Hanafis. Right? That these are the proof you use, they're ma'lul. They have defects in the chain of transmission or the text. But the Hanafis frequently quote from it because it's got their proofs. And it's sort of like one of the best ways to beat someone in their argument is to flip their argument on its head. Now it's one of the great mysteries of the science of hadith, apparent mysteries, that Imam al-Daraqutni, who was a great Imam of hadith, is one of those who critiqued the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari and found objections to 100 and something hadiths in Sahih al-Bukhari, all of which were answered. And the final conclusive answer was given by Ibn Hajar, but it was answered even by his contemporaries. So, and of course, in the Hanafi school, the dog is not najis al-ayn. The dog is just considered like any other non-edible animal. Only the pig is najis al-ayn. Some Hanafis consider an elephant to be like a big pig, but that's not correct. A minority of Hanafis consider the dog to be najis al-ayn, but it's not the case. So technically, if you see Hamza really felt like it, you could wear like a winter coat made out of dog skin with a dog head dangling behind your head. Okay? It'd be permissible if it's tan. And as for the hadith, of course, the Hanif quote this version of the hadith deliberately. Why? Because some of the narrations mention. So, as for washing a container that the dog drank from, or washing clothing, right? The most famous narration mentions that it should be washed 7 times. One of them with turab, with dirt. And the Shafi'i is active on that. Okay? But there's a few issues. One, the narrations themselves come with different wordings. Like this one from Daraqutni, it mentions 3 times, or 5 times, or 7 times. So why did we choose the 7th? This one doesn't mention the turab. But also because the narrator himself, namely Abu Hurairah, did not act on what he narrated. And we'll see a little more about the removal of filth. Right? So it's understood that the amr of washing 7 times was an amr irshad. It's sort of للمبالغة, to be thorough in washing. To be thorough in washing. And similarly, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned about removing of certain filth, that to rub it and scrape it and then to wash it. Neither the rubbing nor the scraping is a requirement, it's for للمبالغة في إزالة النجاسة. The Hanafi state, what's the general ruling? What is the duty with respect to removal of filth? It's to remove it. فكل ما تزال به النجاسة تحصل. The removal of filth is a practical matter, it's a tangible matter. It's an amrun hissi. It's not an amrun shar'i. It's not najasa is a tangible thing. It must be removed. It's not a shar'i meaning that needs to be realized. Okay, unlike hadath, for example. Okay. أو شرب منه الخنزير, or that a pig drank from. لنجاسة عينه, because the pig is essentially filthy. لقوله سبحانه وتعالى فإنه رجس, because it is filthy. Right? And the ضمير there, the asl in the ضمير is that it goes back to the entirety of something, unless it's evidently not the case. Okay? Unless it's evidently not the case. Ibn Hazm took this to a literal consequence that's not sound, because the Prophet told Sayyidina Jabir, Unzur ilayha, look at her. So Ibn Hazm, some other literalists understood that the person wanting to marry can look at the entirety of a woman, even secretly, then except the front and rear private parts, because they're excluded by explicit Quranic verse. And there's some people who try to pull that off. I've been asked at least half a dozen questions. Well, there's no dispensation for that. Those kinds of opinions of the literalists, Imam al-Juwayni said, اختلاف الظاهرية لا يلتفت إليه. The difference of opinion of the literalists is given no attention. It's considered to be outside of sound legal reasoning. Okay, they know this. أو شرب منه شيء بمعنى حيوان من سباع البهائم, or any animal from any predatory animal drank from. احترز به عن سباع الطير. This excludes predatory birds, which will be coming. وسيأتي حكمها. والسبع, and what's a predatory animal? حيوان مختطف منتهب عاد عادة. Right? Is an animal that captures and attacks its prey, and is by default aggressive. كالفهد, right? والذئب, right? Like foxes and wolves. والضبع والنمر والسبع والقرد لتولد لعابها من لحمها وهو نجس كلبنها, because the saliva emerges from the meat and its meat is najis just as its milk. Okay? So the milk also follows the ruling of the meat. So edible animals is milk would be permissible, non-edible animals is milk would be impermissible. والقسم الثالث, the third category, مكروه استعماله. السؤر مكروه استعماله is leftover water that is disliked to use في الطهارة, in purification, right? كراهة التنزيه, and it's somewhat disliked. But it's not only in طهارة, and likewise in drinking and in cooking with them. وكذا الشرب والطبخ. إن وجد غيره, if one finds other than this. And what is it? That's why he says مع وجود غيره, if other than this water is available. مما لا كراهة فيه, of the kind of water that's not disliked. ولا يكره عند عدم الماء, but it's not disliked if there is no other water. لأنه طاهر, because it's pure. ولا يجوز المصير إلى التيمم مع وجوده, and it's not permissible to you to make tayammum when this water is available. And what is it? Let's read the method for a moment. وهو سؤر الهرة والدجاجة المخلاة. It's the leftover water of a cat, meaning a domesticated cat here, or a chicken that roams amongst the filth. وسباع الطير, and predatory birds. كالصقر والشاهين والحدأ, and predatory birds like the mentioned birds. وهو, so let's go back to the commentary. وهو سؤر الهرة, and it's leftover water for cat. الأهلية, and this is the domestic cat, as opposed to the wild cat. Okay. So now they say a cat that's that's found in cities is assumed to be domestic, but you normally don't have like mountain cats or like wild cats roaming cities. Okay. So Hamza got a cat, you love the cat didn't love you, it left you, you're heartbroken, but that cat doesn't become a wild cat, it's still a domestic cat. So cats found in cities are assumed to be domestic, even if they're aggressive. Cats found outside cities are assumed to be wild, unless evidently domestic. Okay. So why is now the qiyas, the legal reasoning would be that a cat's saliva should be najis. Why? What? No, that's not.
You can't eat cat's meat.
Yeah, you can't eat cat's meat. Cat's meat is najis. Saliva follows the ruling of the meat. So if the cat's meat is najis, the assumption would be its meat would be najis. Therefore, you should not be able to, so water that the cat drank from should be najis. But he says, لِسُقُوطِ حُكْمِ النَّجَاسَةِ اتِّفَاقًا بِعِلَّةِ الطَّوَافِ, because the ruling of filth was lifted by agreement because of the legal cause of it roaming amongst us, right? Al-mansus alayhi, but this legal cause has been textually established. بقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم, by the Prophet's words, and the illah, this is the illah mansusa, right? The legal cause underlying the ruling, sometimes it can be derived, right? And there's criteria by which legal cause is derived. Ultimately, only the most sensitive thing related to ijtihad is the derivation of the legal cause of something, and ultimately that's only the duty of the mujtahid. Because if you can establish what is the legal cause of something, you can then make analogy on it, right? And you need تعيين العلة وإعمال القياس. This is من أبواب الاجتهاد, right? specifying what is the underlying legal cause for this ruling, because الحكم يدور مع علته, because the ruling revolves with its legal cause, إثباتا ونفيا, in affirmation or in negation. إذا وجدت العلة وجد الحكم. If the legal cause is found, the ruling is found. وإلا فلا, and if not, then the ruling is not found. And once you know the legal cause, if you find another thing that shares a legal cause, this is qiyas, this is analogy. Who does qiyas? The mujtahid does qiyas fully. Because a full qiyas entails deducing what the legal cause is and then applying it to another thing. There's a lesser qiyas that is done by lower level, by high level scholars within the madhab, which is extending an established illah to new issues, right? But that's all outside the scope here. But when it comes to cats, the legal cause why their saliva is not considered najis was affirmed by the Prophet ﷺ himself. The only reason he affirmed it because the asl would be that it would be najis. And this is a type of istihsan, this type of legal preference. Because the primary line of legal reasoning in the Hanafi school is referred to as the qiyas. That's a different type of qiyas. Qiyas can one refer to extending one ruling to another on the basis of shared legal cause, of a shared illah. But qiyas also refers to the general legal reasoning, that were you not to consider specific evidence, the general principles would entail that it's valid. Right? So here, the general general legal reasoning would entail that that the saliva of a cat is filthy, but it's been deemed non-filthy. Why? Because of the Prophet saying, إِنَّهَا لَيْسَتْ بِنَجِسَةٍ, it is not filthy. Right? And here it's referring to its saliva. إِنَّهَا مِنَ الطَّوَافِينَ عَلَيْكُمْ وَالطَّوَافَاتِ, it is of those who roam amongst you and around you. قال الترمذي حديث حسن صحيح. Imam al-Tirmidhi said this is a sound and rigorously authentic hadith. Big difference of opinion amongst the scholars of hadith. What does hadith hasan sahih mean? Imam al-Tirmidhi used this terminology. Now, they said it appeared to be contradictory, because a hadith sahih is one that fulfills the highest criteria of soundness. A hadith hasan is below that. So what does hadith hasan and sahih? It would appear to be joining between two contradictory attributes. So there are different opinions regarding al-hadith al-hasan al-sahih. Some said it's hasan wa sahih. Right? So there's an implicit well. Hadith hasan sahih. One is that it's hasan wa sahih, that it's sound and rigorously authentic. So it's like a type of emphasis. Others said that it is hasan almost sahih. Others said that, this is a weaker opinion, that this is a hadith that has more than one chain. Some are sound and others are rigorously authentic. Right? And there's several other opinions. Then of course, then there's another one that puts that Imam Tirmidhi is one of the earlier scholars. He doesn't necessarily use this terminology in a consistent way throughout. That he had multiple usages for the term Hasan Sahih, as many of the early scholars are wont to do. But Allahu A'lam, that it being used for emphasis, that is Hasan and Sahih, used for emphasis, would appear to be the stronger one. Although there is a case to be made that uses it in more than one way depending on context. Allahu A'lam. That's something to ask the muhaddithin, but if you ask 5 muhaddithin, you'll probably get 6 answers. It's one of those 1,000-year-old differences. Now, the su'ur of the hirra, right, the leftover water of cat, says, لكن يكره سؤرها تنزيها على الأصح. its leftover water is somewhat disliked, according to more reliable opinion. لأنها لا تتحامى عن النجاسة, because cats don't keep away from filth. They're predatory animals. Even when domesticated, they'll eat. If you leave them on their own, they'll go catch mice and this and that. So it's somewhat disliked, but it's not intrinsically disliked, but it's disliked due to the possibility of filth. So it follows the same principles as the other things where there's possibility of filth. The same thing applies. كماء غمس صغير يده فيه. Right? Like water in which a young child puts their hand in. Right? If the child is all dirty and messy and they got najasa on them, then it would be better not to use that water for filth. But if the child's clean and there's no likely najasa, then it wouldn't. This wouldn't be an issue. But then an issue arises that the Prophet ﷺ tilted the bowl for the cat to drink from, and you're saying it's makruh to make wudu with water that a cat drank from. But the Prophet said, well, why would he tilt, and it's makruh to drink it? Why would he tilt the water for the cat? Then now that's rendering the water makruh, and then people are going to consume it. And the Prophet would not do something makruh. So one simple answer is tashri'ah. He did it tashri'an wa bayanan lil hukm. He did it legislatively. And if a Prophet does something legislatively, it makes the somewhat disliked permissible. Bayanan lil jawaz. And that's how we understand the Prophet ﷺ, for example, when the hadith of Mughira bin Shu'bah, and the Nabi ﷺ أتى سبادة قوم فبال قائما. That the Prophet ﷺ came to the garbage dump of a people, so it's outside the town, away from people, and he urinated while standing. You see from a distance. Related to Mughira bin Shu'bah. And they said, is one bayan that is permissible, but generally superior not to do, but when there's a need, etc., you could do it. That's one, it's tashri'ah. Therefore, that does not happen with the prohibited, happens with the dislike. The dislike may be allowed in certain contexts. The other, which is why Sayyidah Aisha denied that hadith. But they said they saw it, she didn't. So the muthbit muqaddam ala nafi, the one who affirms is given precedence in transmission over the one who denies. It's very hard to make a categorical negation. Right? But then he answers this implicit question. How will the Prophet do this? He says, وَحُمِلَ إِصْغَاءُ النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم لَهَا الْإِنَاءِ. The Prophet tilting the container for the cat is interpreted على زوال ذلك الوهم بعلمه بحالها, by the possibility of it being najis being lifted by his knowing that it had no najasa. For example, the cat had been indoors for sufficient time that had there been filth in its mouth, its saliva would have done away with it. في زمان لا يتوهم نجاسة فمها بمنجس تناولته, by having not consumed any najasa for sufficient time for its mouth to be clear. It says والهرة البرية سؤرها نجس لفقد علة الطواف فيها. But the non-domestic cat, the berriya, the cat, the wild cat, the bar is literally the countryside, right? But meaning the wild cat, its saliva is najis because it does not have the illah of tawaf, of it roaming amongst us, as opposed to domesticated cats. ويكره أن تلحس الهرة كف إنسان ثم يصلي قبل غسله. It is makruh, meaning somewhat disliked, for a cat to lick someone's palm and then to pray without washing it. Because of that possibility of najasa, it's somewhat disliked. So it would be superior if you can to wash. Unless it's been inside, just been in the same room as you for a while, then it's fine. Right? Same reasoning, right? Because the karaha of its saliva is because of the possibility of najasa. Right? Not intrinsically. Okay. أو يأكل بقية ما أكلت منه إن كان غنيا يجد غيره. Or to eat the food that the cat ate from, meaning from the same container. Now you're eating and the cat's eating. The other would be to separate its food, not to have it eat from the same. But if it does, it'll be makruh to eat from it if you have other food. Right? In كان غنيا, whereas it being wealthy is not a condition. It just mentioned incidentally. For someone to be poor but have enough food. ولا يكره أكله للفقير للضرورة. It's not disliked to eat it for the poor person because of necessity. And Imam Tahtawi says it's not the issue of being poor or not, it's do you have other food. And the other category, and we'll read this and then pause, وَسُؤْرُ الدَّجَاجَةِ الْمُخَلَّةِ. Right? And now dajaja, he says بالتثليث. Right? بتثليث الدال. Right? You can say الدجاجة, الدجاجة, and الدجاجة. بتثليث الدال. The dal takes all three حركات. Most common is the فتحة. وتاؤها للوحدة. The ta, meaning the ta al-marbuta at the end, الدجاجة, is for the singular. The category is الدجاج. Dajaja is used for the singular, للوحدة. Like you say al-baqar for the category. The individual is called al-baqar. Right? There's many other examples of that in Arabic. لا للتأنيث. It's not for the feminine. والدجاج مشترك بين الذكر والأنثى. Right? And the word dajaj applies both to the male and the female. Tahtawi really disagrees with him here. وَالدَّجَاجَةُ الْأُنْثَى خَاصَّةً. And so here there's an apparent contradiction in what Imam Ashrumbulani is saying, as Tahtawi points out, because he said that dajaja is used for the singular and dajaj for the category. But then he said dajaj is used for the male and dajaja for the female. So it would appear to be a contradiction. This is how the fuqaha distinguish between the two. So the Arabic language, dajaja is used for the singular. Okay? So there's a category dajaj. Dajaja refers to the singular without consideration whether it's male or female. Right? But the fuqaha use dajaj for male, dajaja for the female. And then that goes back to usage as well. لهذا لو حلف أن لا يأكل لحم دجاجة لا يحنث بلحم الديك. So someone swears an oath that they will not eat the meat of a dajaja, of a chicken. If you eat a deek, like a rooster, you would not break your vow. Okay? Of course, alhamdulillah, we don't. ويكره السؤر المخلى. Right? It's disliked to have the leftover water of a roaming animal التي تجول في القاذورات, that goes amongst the filth. ولم يعلم طهارة منقارها, and one does not know that its beak was pure. من نجاسة, من نجاسته, from filth. فكره سؤرها للشك. So its leftover water will be disliked because of doubt. فإن لم يكن كذلك فلا كراهة فيه. But if there's no doubt about its beak, the beak of this, roaming bird to be filthy, then it would not be disliked. It could be said, such that it was, kept cooped up for a while, right? فلا يصل منقارها لقدر, so that its beak does not reach any qadar, here referring to najasa. In other words, you might say, well, we don't deal with chickens. People do. There's a trend even in the GTA of people keeping chickens in their backyards. Right? And then you have, someone has a decorative pool in the back, and this said, how about, can I make wudu in it? But well, your chicken drinks from it. What's the state of the chickens? Right? Do they, because is there a lot of filth around? Yes or no? And they would follow this fiqh. Right? So if you want some excitement, bring some wild animals into your life. Right? وَسُؤْرُ سِبَاعِ الطَّيْرِ كَالصَّقْرِ وَالشَّاهِينِ وَالْحِدْأَةِ وَالرُّخَمِ وَالْغُرَابِ مَكْرُوهٌ. Right? And the leftover water of predatory birds, such as those mentioned, is makruh. Right? Now, this is an interesting issue, right? Which he'll explain why. Right? So لأنها تخالط الميتات والنجاسات فأشبهت الدجاجة المخلاة, because it roams around. These predatory birds go around dead animals and filth, so they resemble the roaming chicken. That's not the primary reason, right? حتى لو تيقن أنه لا نجاسة على منقارها لا يكره سؤرها. So much so that if it's sure that there's no filth affecting its beak, then its leftover water is not makruh. وكان القياس نجاسته. Here qiyas is not, the usuli meaning of qiyas is to derive the ruling of something, is to affirm the ruling of something regarding which a specific ruling is not textually affirmed, by identifying a shared legal cause, a shared illah, with something whose ruling is textually affirmed. That's qiyas. That's in the usuli sense. So for example, what is the illah for the prohibition of alcohol? Right? Is that it intoxicates. So is there any hadiths about cocaine? No, there isn't. Okay. But we know the illah for the prohibition of alcohol, right? So we would affirm the illah for the prohibition of drugs based on qiyas upon what is textually affirmed, etc. But here qiyas is used for a broader legal sense. That qiyas is referring to primary legal reasoning. Like, were there no specific texts about this, or secondary considerations, the general principles of fiqh would entail that the leftover water of predatory birds would be filthy. Why? Because they're meat. Can you eat the predatory animal, the predatory bird? No. Right? So he tells us. وَكَانَ الْقِيَاسُ نَجَسَتُهُ لِحُرْمَةِ لَحْمِهَا. The primary legal reasoning would entail that the leftover water of predatory birds would be filthy because of its meat being impermissible. كَسِبَاعِ الْبَهَائِمِ, like wild animals, like predatory wild animals, right? لكن طهارته استحسان, but its being pure is legal preference. استحسان. استحسان is العدول عن قياس جلي إلى قياس خفي لعارض. Right? استحسان is leaving evident legal reasoning for less evident legal reasoning due to preponderating factors. That could be a nas, right? It could be a primary text. It could be hardship. It could be need. It could be a number of criteria, and we'll be looking at that further. He could have discussed it here, but he discusses the issue of qiyas and istihsan for those interested further ahead in the chapter on sujood al-tilawa. Now, why would there be istihsan? One, there are texts that would indicate that it wouldn't be filthy. in the countryside, there will be many pools of small water. Predatory birds drink from it, and if you determine that if a predatory bird drank from a small pool of water, then farmers and people in the countryside can't cover over small pools of water. It would mean they either kill off all the predatory birds, which is very harmful, or you deem all that small water to be filthy, which would be a hardship. And the Prophet ﷺ did not do that. There's other indications that it's not najis. Why is it not najis? He says, وجه الاستحسان. لكن طهارته استحسان لأنها تشرب بمنقارها. Because predatory birds drink with their beak. وهو عظم طاهر, and it is a pure bone. وسباع البهائم, on the other hand, predatory animals تشرب بلسانها, drink with their tongue. وهو مبتل بلعابها النجس, and their tongue is wet with their filthy saliva. They said no, there's a distinction. So predatory animals, and it's easier to keep lions and hyenas and foxes away from your pool of water than an eagle that swoops down and flies away. Right? وسؤر سواكن البيوت, right? And domestic pests, literally residents in your home, but meaning sawakin biyut, the pests that live in your house, not referring to your younger sister or brother. مما له دم سائل, of that which has flowing blood. كالفأرة والحية والوزغة, like mice and snakes and the like. Its leftover water is makruh. للزوم طوافها, because these two are amongst us, right? وحرمة لحمها النجس, because if it has flowing blood, then its meat is najis. لا كذلك سؤر العقرب. What is a عقرب? Scorpion. But the leftover water of a scorpion, والخنفس والصرصر. What is a صرصر? Cockroach. And صرصر has multiple spellings to pronunciation. Sarsar and sursur and several others. Right? لعدم نجاستها, because they're not filthy. فلا كراهة فيه, they're not disliked. They're not permissible to eat because they're mustaqla, but they're not najis. Even if it dies, even a cockroach dies in the water is not filthy. Now for health reasons you may avoid drinking the water, but it's not najis. Can you deliberately use it though? You cannot eat cockroaches, right? Because something being pure does not mean that it is permissible to eat. Sand is pure, but not permissible to eat. Okay? Permissibility of eating has several other conditions. And the fourth category is سؤر مشكوك. والقسم الرابع سؤر مشكوك أي متوقف في حكم طهوريته. The fourth category is a very rare category, so we're just going to go over it quickly, is leftover water regarding which there is doubt as to whether it is purifying. It is pure for sure, but there is tawaqquf. Would it be purifying or not? Because of the difference of opinion on the status of those animals and whether they're edible or not. فَلَمْ يُحْكَمْ بِكَوْنِهِ مُطَهِّرًا. So Imam Abu Hanifa paused as to whether the water left over from their drinking would be purifying or not. وَلَمْ يَنْفِ عَنْهُ الطَّهُورِيَّةِ. But its being pure was not negated. وَهُوَ سُؤْرُ الْبَغْلِ وَالْحِمَارِ. And it is the leftover water of a mule or a donkey. And what is a mule? الَّذِي أُمُّهُ أَتَانِ. Right? Is that whose mother is a atan. What's an atan?
Female dog.
Is because a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. But an atan is what? Is a female what?
I think donkey.
Is a female donkey. Because animals are ascribed to their maternal lineage, as opposed to humans who are ascribed to their paternal lineage, right? Just which the Shaykh said it's conceivable that you could have, if there. Okay, I won't mention this. I'll mention it off camera. It could have implications on Eid Day in terms of the khatib and then what's slaughtered afterwards. والحمار هو يصدق على الذكر والأنثى. And the حمار refers to male and female. لأن لعابه طاهر على الصحيح, because its saliva is pure according to the relied upon position. والشك لتعارض الخبرين في إباحة لحمه وحرمته. And the doubt is because there's different texts about the permissibility of its meat or not. والبغل متولد من الحمار فأخذ حكمه. And the mule is born from a donkey, so it takes up its ruling. فإن لم يجد المحدث غيره, if the person in ritual period does not find other than the leftover water of a بغل or حمار, mule or donkey, أي غير سؤر البغل والحمار, توضأ وتيمم. توضأ به, one makes wudu with it because it is pure, could be purifying, but because you're not sure it's purifying, you, the imam, not sure whether it's purifying, you have to make tayammum as well. وَالْأَفْضَلُ تَقْدِيمُ الْوُضُوء. And it's superior. You could begin with either one, but it is better to begin with wudu لِقَوْلِ زُفَرْ بِلُزُومِ تَقْدِيمِهِ, because Imam Zufar, who was the third main student of Imam Abu Hanifa, said you have to begin with the wudu. وَالْأَحْوَطْ أَنْ يَنْوِيَ الاختلاف في لزوم النية. Right? And it's superior to intend in both the wudu and the tayammum, right? في الوضوء بسؤر الحمار. Right? There's a difference of opinion about that. ثم صلى. Then one prays. فتكون صلاته صحيحة بيقين. Then your prayer is for sure valid. لأن الوضوء به لو صح لم يضره التيمم وكذا عكسه. Because if your wudu was valid, the tayammum afterwards would not harm, and likewise the other way around. ومن قال من مشايخنا إن سؤر الفحل نجس لأنه يشم البول فتنجس شفتاه فهو غير سليم. And those of our ulama, meaning of the Hanafis, who said that the fahl, what's the fahl? That the leftover water of the male horse, for example, would be filthy because it smells urine. Like, this is not correct, because then its lips would be najis. Why? لأنه أمر موهوم, because it's an imagined matter. لا يغلب وجوده, and it's not غالب, it's not the general case. ولا يؤثر في إزالة الثابت, and اليقين لا يزول بالشك, and certainty is not lifted by doubt. ويستحب غسل الأعضاء بعد ذلك الماء لإزالة أثر المشكوك. And if you use doubtful, الماء المشكوك, afterwards, it's when you find other water, it's recommended, not obligatory, to wash one's lips, just to avoid the athar of something regarding which there's shak, even though they're not shak in its tahara, but just out of caution. And likewise, if you use makruh water, it's recommended to repeat the wudu. So we'll stop there today. The next section is brief but very important, which is on tahadri, on what happens if you have to exercise your judgment about the purity of water or clothing, and also that there's a number of other rulings that come up in Hashiyat al-Tahtawi. But what happens if there's difference regarding meat? Some said you mixed up the meats. Okay, so you went out with a non-Muslim coworker, and there's 3 Muslims, 3 non-Muslims, and you bought 2 halal falafels and 2 halal shawarmas and 2 haram shawarmas, and then you got them mixed up. What do you do? So we'll look at that. and there's a number of other issues related to the dhabiha and many other things as well. So that's an important chapter, and then we come to well water, which we'll try to cover quickly. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.